Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today in Tallinn, Estonia at the Estonian War Museum, taking a look at a super cool and extremely rare Estonian submachine gun. This is in fact the Estonian submachine gun, also known as the Arsenal Tallinn submachine gun. It didn't really have a designation, or doesn't have one that's well recognized today. This is the one submachine gun that was developed in Estonia in the interwar period. So Arsenal Tallinn is, or was, the state-owned arms manufacturing facility of the Estonian government. And it's set up not long after Estonia gets its independence in 1920, because basically the Estonian government and military realized that they need some sort of centralized workshop to repair and maintain small arms, as well as other military equipment. So in 1921, they find a nice big building on Erika Street in Tallinn, and they start bringing small workshops together and combining them into one joint facility. Now, at first, for the early years, this wasn't just a small arms repair facility, it was an everything repair facility. Like, if you had broken furniture in the barracks, it would come to the carpentry shop on Erika Street to be fixed. Vehicle maintenance, small arms, like everything the military had, the maintenance was done there. And over the course of the next few years, the facility gets larger, gets more capable. Between 1921 and 1924, they bring in a bunch of German machine tools. And in 1924, it's officially named Arsenal Tallinn. And at that point, they start manufacturing not firearms, but repair parts for firearms. So firing pins, springs, the small parts, just things to help keep guns in service. Estonia has a wide variety of firearms, and Arsenal over the years would start to do a lot of rebuilding and remanufacturing of small arms. In particular, Estonia had most Nagant rifles. They had Arisaka rifles that they had gotten largely from the Finns as well as from the Russians. They had Enfields, and we're talking here specifically 1917 pattern Enfields, or 1914 Enfields, sorry. And all of these needed repair work, and a bunch of them were actually rechambered. So among the other things that they did, Arsenal would rebarrel something like 23,000 Arisakas to the .303 cartridge because they didn't have a large supply of Japanese 6.5 ammunition. They rebuilt Mosins into patterns like this. I have a separate video on one of these if you're interested in it. Oh, and one of the other big projects for Arsenal was development of armored cars. Between 24 to 25 or 25 to 26, they did a bunch of development on armored car production, started making those in 25, manufactured, I think, 13 completely domestic armored cars by 1928. That's probably one of the better known Arsenal projects. But starting in 1926, they put in the development of their own submachine gun. And this is largely based on the German MP18-1, the World War I German Schmeisser submachine gun. And it would develop over a couple of years into a successful project. They ultimately did a 5,500 round endurance test on one of the pre-production guns. They manufactured the first 5 prototypes in 1926. And then the gun goes into production, albeit very limited production. So let's take a closer look at this example, and let me show you a couple of the neat features about it. All right, we're going to take this apart in a moment, but first, I want to point out interesting, unusual element here. The magazine on this actually has a slight backwards cant to it. The reason for that is that this is chambered for 9x20 Browning. That's a semi-rimmed cartridge. This, by the way, is a 50-round magazine. That was the standard for Arsenal. That 9x20 semi-rimmed cartridge is pretty obscure today, but in the 1920s, it was a cartridge that had some limited military acceptance. FN manufactured a simple blowback military pistol, the FN 1903. It's essentially like the same as a Colt 1903 pocket hammerless, but scaled up to military service pistol size and chambered for 9x20. It was the most common version of it is actually the Swedish pattern adopted in 1907, and the Estonian Army formally adopted it in 1923. So that was their standard service pistol cartridge, was 9x20 Browning semi-rimmed, so they wanted a submachine gun to match it. Now, the one other submachine gun out there in 9x20 semi-rimmed is also Swedish, because they also adopted it for their pistols. It's the original Swedish Model 37 Suomi, and if you look at that, it has a bottom-mounted magazine which is also canted slightly backwards. And that's just because the semi-rimmed design of the cartridge requires this rearward cant in order to stack properly in the magazine and not have feed issues. This ensures that you don't get rim lock by having each rim slightly behind the one above it. So that's your magazine right there. I will also point out that while the Army adopted the FN 1903, a lot of officers and even some non-coms actually were issued FN 1910 pistols in 32 ACP. So the Army kind of used both, but 9x20 was their standard combat cartridge, you could say. Arsenal really didn't do much marking on these guns. This was their only submachine gun, so I guess it just wasn't considered that important to designate which one it was. It was just the submachine gun. So we'll see a serial number on it, and then we have this marking on the magazine well. This is an Estonian Defense League crest. You could also find them with a KL for Defense League. And then 1934 was the date of manufacture here. The serial number is located on the rear tang. This is number 155. So despite the fact that these were developed and tested by the mid-1920s, you know, the endurance testing was done in 1926, production was relatively slow, because you can see we've only built 155 of them by the time we get to the mid-1930s. The magazine is a double stack, double feed design, like I said, 50 rounds, and it has kind of this unique design to it as a result of that kind of unique geometry to the 9x20 cartridge, and this distinctive sort of sunken groove along the front end of, or the front face of the magazine. Design-wise, this takes most of its cues from the German MP18. So we've got a big hinge here. This is a tubular receiver, but it is a milled tube. It's very much a first-generation type of submachine gun. It's a simple blowback action. It fires from an open bolt. So that's the firing position. And then it has a progressive trigger. So if I pull the trigger just a little bit, the bolt will fire and then catch. If I pull the trigger all the way back, the gun will continue to fire in full auto until I release it. So for that reason, there is no selector switch down here. So we do have a lock open notch as a safety mechanism. There is also a manual safety, and that's here at the back of the trigger guard. If you pop that little lever down, it simply prevents you from pulling the trigger far enough to release, and then you flip it back in to fire. Like the MP18, the front sight is just a big triangular post. The rear sight is a tangent leaf style. It is graduated out to 600 meters, which is pretty optimistic, but also pretty typical for submachine guns of this period. And we have a trapdoor in the butt plate to store a cleaning kit. Disassembly is very much like a German Schmeisser. We're just going to push that catch forward, and then the whole gun pivots open. On the underside here, we just have an open stock, nothing really to see. The fire control mechanism is contained inside there, like I said, a progressive trigger. And then to remove the bolt, we are going to take the end cap and rotate it so that this line lines up with that there. And then we can pull the end cap off. We have a Thompson style little small diameter recoil spring. And once that's out, you can take the bolt out. The bolt drops down here. So this would, if the gun's assembled, this is below the line of the stock, which prevents the bolt from potentially coming out otherwise. Take that out. This one, by the way, unfortunately is missing its extractor, and it's been demilitarized in a couple of ways, sadly. But we have one of the more unusual elements here for a gun of this design. Instead of having a separate firing pin assembly that just slips into the bolt, Arsenal went ahead and actually threaded their firing pin assembly into the bolt. And unfortunately, this has also been demilled. The firing pin has been clipped off. But originally, the firing pin would have been right there, and it would have been about this long. It would protrude out the face of the bolt, having this act as a open bolt, slam fire, simple blowback submachine gun. So there's nothing else going on here on the bolt. However, we have these two big openings in the front, which are kind of interesting. Those are part of the feed system. So there are two matching lugs or blocks here inside the action. Those are attached to the end of the barrel, or the trunnion. And they are basically the front end of the feed lips. So the feed lips back here hold the rounds in the magazine, but they don't really do anything to direct the cartridges as they're being pushed up out of the magazine. When I insert this in, and that's all the way in, you can see that these lugs line up nicely with the feed lips of the magazine there. So the front of the feed lips are just built in to the trunnion. That's kind of cool. I don't think I've seen that on a gun like this before. And then a couple other features to point out. The barrel is ribbed. Early submachine gun designs from around this period often assumed that you would want a way to cool the barrels. That, of course, turns out to be not particularly important, and people stopped doing it by the end of World War II, but not uncommon to see flutes, ribs, this sort of thing on guns of this period. We have some cool geometry here on the nose cap of the gun. Originally, there would have been a locking screw right there to hold this in place, and I believe with that screw removed, you could originally have unthreaded the barrel and taken it out. This particular example, like I said, has been demilled. The barrel has been drilled and I believe welded in place because it does not want to unscrew. But that's how it originally would have worked. And there you go. There is the Tallinn Arsenal submachine gun field stripped. The overall numbers are a little bit hazy because, for some reason, a lot of Arsenal's records were destroyed in 1940, but in total, about 600 of these guns were ultimately manufactured. And what's interesting is, by far, the biggest purchaser of them was not the Estonian Defense Forces, it was the Estonian Defense League, which is, or was, an organization relatively similar to the Finnish Civil Guard. It wasn't quite like the US National Guard in that it was not a direct arm of the military. It wasn't controlled by the military. It was much more like a civil militia, half social club, half army training. Those guys recognized the value of submachine guns actually much more than the army did, which I suppose isn't that uncommon for the late 1920s and early 1930s period. This is when there were a lot of armies were testing submachine guns and deciding, like, what would we even do with this? Well, the Estonian Defense League knew exactly what they would do with them. So they bought more than 400 of these. The army got about 100, and then the Estonian police also got somewhere around 100. Again, like I said, the numbers are a little hazy. The guns would stay in service for about 10 years. In 1935, Estonia adopts the Browning High Power as its new service pistol, and that was for the Defense Forces, the Army, as well as the Defense League and the police. At that point, they start looking at 9x19 for a submachine gun to match it, just so they have caliber compatibility. There is a version of Tallinn's submachine gun that is developed in 1937 and 38. It's a modernized gun. It's no longer quite so World War I-ish, and it's chambered for 9x19, but ultimately, because of politics and money, it doesn't ever go into production. And instead, in 1938, the Estonians decide to adopt the Finnish Suomi, the KP31. And so they purchase about 500 Suomis just before the Winter War breaks out in Finland. Best number I found is like 485 Suomis actually showed up here in Estonia. And in order to do that, they actually sold all of the old 9x20 millimeter submachine guns. Apparently a few of them went to Latvia, but the vast majority went to Spain. Spain, of course, was in the middle of its own civil war. The Spanish were highly interested in buying any and all small arms they could get their hands on. All sorts of oddball stuff from around the world got into Spain in the late 1930s. So Tallinn, Arsenal, looks at this situation and realizes that it's cheaper to sell the existing guns, take that money, add a little bit more money, and buy new manufacturer Suomis already in 9x19 than it would be to remanufacture these guys into 9x19. So ultimately, these go to Spain, and that's a big part of the reason why they are so scarce today, is they just didn't survive Spanish Civil War use, and then a lot of them that did survive were destroyed after the war. So it's interesting, like the most common thing you can find related to Tallinn, Arsenal Tallinn submachine guns is in fact just buttstocks. Like someone uncovered a cache of buttstocks for these guns in Spain not that long ago. Apparently they destroyed or recycled, scrapped, I don't know exactly what, but the metal parts of the gun were destroyed and the stocks were saved for some reason. So finding an intact gun like this is extremely rare. And I'd like to give a big thanks to the Estonian Army Museum for being willing to pull this off the wall and show it to me. If you happen to be in Tallinn, this isn't a large museum. Definitely plan to take an hour or two to come here, check it out. They have some really cool displays of some really interesting small arms. Estonia, as a small country, very interested in national defense, has some really interesting stories from World War II all the way through, well, before World War II, all the way up to the present day, and some cool guns on display, including this one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.